I just had a moment to go back over the statement from Barack and Michelle Obama, and they are supportive of President Joe Biden's decision not to seek re-election, and they praise his outstanding track record as president. And yet a paragraph sort of buried in this long statement, the Obamas say, "We will be navigating uncharted waters in the days ahead, but I have extraordinary confidence that the leaders of our party will be able to create a process from which an outstanding nominee emerges." Why aren't the Obamas backing Vice President Kamala Harris?
That's a good question. Well, that's a good question.
There is some tension between the Obama and Biden camp right now. And as Senator Welch just told you here on CBS, there is a bit of hesitation among some Democrats to get ahead what they believe will be a truncated process to formally make Vice President Harris the nominee. As we detailed earlier in our conversation, Vice President Harris has known President Obama since he was a state senator going to San Francisco for fundraisers. She helped him in Iowa in 2008 when he ran for president. There is a relationship there. And I would be surprised that if in the coming days President Obama did not formally get behind Vice President Harris, but there is a sense among some people close to President Obama and President Biden that they can't be rushing out statements because of the sensitivity Biden has about how this has played out. President Biden, especially his closest advisors and family members, are unhappy that they feel he was put in a corner to make this decision. Often they feel his hand was forced by those close to President Obama. And for President Obama to let President Biden have his moment with this decision. Think about this. President Obama knows that President Biden is now in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, making the biggest decision of his career with a statement because he's coughing as he looks at the shore with his family, because he's recovering from COVID. To then start making this about Vice President Harris in the annals of presidential history would be perhaps a step too far because of this sensitivity. In the wake of that debate, which so many Democrats say was disastrous, I have been told that President Obama and President Biden have only spoken once, maybe once more, but likely only once, that there's a real belief that in the Biden camp that Obama didn't play this as they would have had hoped. They want him to be on the trail to help the Democrats. But I'm not surprised that President Obama is just trying to leave it be with President Biden, knowing he's recovering from COVID, coughing, as he makes this decision.
It's still notable, though.
Oh, sure.
And let me bring in John Dickerson, because I'm looking at the contrast in statements between the Clintons, who said there is no greater threat than Donald Trump. And so they wholeheartedly have put their support behind the Vice President, Kamala Harris. The Obamas are saying that they have confidence that the leaders of our party will create a process from which an outstanding nominee emerges. Is there time for the Democratic Party to go through a process?
You know, there is time, but every little detail of a process that you create, even if it's a truncated one or a mini primary or whatever, every little detail becomes something to fight over. So there is an advantage to a process in the sense that you get the rank and file to feel like they weren't just being forced into a decision. There are some people who wanted Joe Biden to stay, so they already feel like the kind of a cabal plus the media has forced a good man out of a job that they think he should be reelected to. And so what do you do with the people with those bruised feelings? Forcing them into a new nominee right away might not soothe those feelings. I think Bob is exactly right in the sense of you've got to also create the conditions for the party and everyone to celebrate Joe Biden, who has just done something that the more they celebrate what he's done, the more of a contrast they draw to Donald Trump. As Liz Cheney said, here's somebody giving up power. Okay, somebody who their whole career was counted out. So it's giving up power and moving against personal instinct, which is I'm going to show them when they count me out, and it's worked for him. And that's quite a contrast to Donald Trump, who was so desirous to hang on to power that, according to the leaders in his own party, he inspired an attack on the Capitol. So to the extent that you celebrate this decision by Joe Biden in this period of time and don't immediately get on to Harris, it actually works to the Democratic Party's benefit.
It's an excellent point, John Dickerson. Thank you. I want to bring in Margaret Brennan, who also has some new reporting. Margaret?
Well, Nora, I know we're all looking at the timeline saying they don't have a lot of time in their favor. And really, typically, it takes about 2 months to vet a vice presidential candidate, is what I was told. Some of that already underway. It's now underway in an expedited basis. And Democrats are all buzzing about who that could be. And when we look at the thinking here of what Vice President Kamala Harris has to weigh when she makes her decision, there's the chatter about, does she go all-female ticket with Governor Whitmer? Or does she also take into consideration the idea that perhaps she should pick a lawmaker? And if she picks a lawmaker, she can't pick one from a state with a Republican governor, because they would lose that very, narrow majority they have. So there are all these little factors that are being weighed by the vice president at this time. And certainly we know some of the names. There are no surprises on this list. But when you hear, for example, Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, does that speak to Kamala Harris, the vice president, in a way that says we can put gun violence at the top of the ticket as an issue? We can put someone who has, a competitive, there's a competitive Senate race in that state, and Democratic governor who would likely appoint another Democrat to that spot? Or do you go with the two governors I've heard the most about in recent days, Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, who just had a powerful speech last Saturday and Sunday, Nora, in the wake of the rally with the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, someone who has been vocal about the scourge of anti-Semitism in this country. Also hear about Governor Beshear quite a lot as well.
Remember the other night when we were at the convention and John Tester issued his statement, being one of the first Democratic senators to say he's got to go, but we've got to open up this nomination process to others. And that was the signal that there's an element of the party that needs to know that there's a more moderate or maybe even Western, Midwestern character involved at the top of the ticket for them going forward, that it's harder. He was signaling, I can't run with Kamala Harris alone on the ticket or someone like her. There needs to be somebody else that speaks to my more moderate politics, my brand of politics. And that's why you look at some of those governors and some of those lawmakers like Mark Kelly from Arizona, a battleground state, has a moderate bipartisan record, is an astronaut, is married to Gabby Giffords, and you think that's the kind of person that a John Tester, a Sherrod Brown, a Jackie Rosen in Nevada, all facing difficult re-elections this year, are going to be comfortable campaigning with in those closing 3 months, and comfortable having them come to their state to campaign in ways that perhaps she couldn't as the running mate, and that Joe Biden now couldn't.
But will the Democratic Party say, we need a moderating force?
Right.
Vice President has a liberal voting record. She is from San Francisco. Will they look to join the ticket someone who is perhaps more of a conservative Democrat, like a Governor Beshear?
Well, that is certainly what someone like Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, who left the Democratic Party, saying that it no longer represents, sort of the flavor of Democrat he once was. He became an independent. He had been advocating for exactly that just hours before Joe Biden made this decision public. But to Ed's point, in terms of going west to Arizona, to a border state, another way to change that conversation perhaps a bit if they go in that direction. But one of the reasons, if we remember 4 years, if we remember back to when Joe Biden was the nominee and how hard that race was, how divided the Democratic Party was, he was a selection of a candidate that was meant to try to bring the very progressive part of the party together with the centrist Democrat that almost doesn't exist anymore if you believe someone like Joe Manchin. So what flavor of Democrat are we going to end up with is definitely a very hot topic. And the belief among many Democrats is that you cannot win with someone who is purely progressive. And so you do need to have someone, particularly a man, on that ticket.